Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology, and today I'm going to talk about astrology, calendars, timekeeping, time zones, and daylight savings time. These are all really intertwined. Precise and accurate timekeeping is a really key part of astrology. I'm going to focus on that today. We're not going to be talking about using calendars or standard timekeeping for prediction because normally we don't. I mean, we don't look at the Gregorian calendar as a way of predicting things astrologically, but we do use the calendar, timekeeping, all that as a way of very precisely orienting ourselves, and that's a key part of astrology. I mean, essentially what we're dealing with an astrological chart is a very specific, very accurate, two-dimensional map of the location of the planets, stars, etc., for a specific time, on a specific date, at a specific place. So obviously the time and date is extremely important. Also, astrology and astronomy, which until the modern period were very much intertwined, were extremely important in terms of determining the calendars and timekeeping, and were very intertwined. So I think it's useful to kind of take a look at that. Astrology is really at root an orientation to celestial cycles. It's allowing us to connect to these to the natural rhythm of things, and as created by the underlying spiritual forces. What we're seeing in the modern world is that we're very disengaged from these natural cycles. So astrology is one way of kind of re-engaging with that. But again, we're going to see this process as we go through this, is that our timekeeping is based on original cycles, and we've gone through this sort of process of disengaging from that in order to have increasing coordination and increasing precision. So timekeeping is interesting. We basically have three fundamental measurements of time, the day, the month, and the year, and none of these quite fit together. And so essentially a lot of the calendar creation and working with calendars has come down to trying to coordinate all these three at once and trying to help them fit together. It's interesting because when it comes to timekeeping, there's not one fundamental unit. If you think of a dollar, $1 equals $100. $101 bills equals $100 bill. It's only one fundamental measurement. Same thing with, like, you think about the metric system. The meter is essentially the fundamental measurement, and it's either subdivided or added together. But as I said, when you've got three different fundamental time units and they don't all perfectly fit together, it causes some complications. It also causes an incredible amount of subtlety and complexity. It's extremely useful and interesting as well. So let's just start talking about some of these fundamental units. I mean, the first and probably most basic is the day. From our standpoint, this is the rising of the sun, which is the beginning of the day at sunrise. The day ends at sunset, and then the night starts at sunset and then continues till sunrise of the next day. Totally fundamental, absolutely essential for growth. It's a sort of fundamental metaphor for life and death. I mean, a really key time measurement, and totally natural. Our life really revolves around it, when there's sun, when there's not sun. Now, the thing about that is obviously when you're talking about the northern or southern hemispheres, that the length of the day is going to vary in summer and winter. I mean, that's just, again, a fundamental reality, is that the days are longer in the summertime and not as long in the wintertime. Of course, they're flipped for northern and southern hemisphere, but those are definitely true. Another timekeeping unit is the week. Now, the week is 100% astrological in origin, 7 planets, 7 days. Each day of the week is ruled by a planet. Moon day is this moon, sun day is the sun. In English, we use the names of these Germanic or Teutonic gods. For the rest, Frigg's day is Friday, for example. Wotan's day is Wednesday. These are dependent on the days, though. And one of the interesting things about the week cycle is that apparently has never changed. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday has never been interrupted since it's begun used. The second fundamental unit is the month. It's based on the moon. And essentially, again, from our perspective, we can look at it either as what's called the synodic moon, which is from new moon to new moon, basically the complete moon phase, which takes 29.3 days. This shows the relationship of the moon and the sun as seen from Earth, because the moon phases are going to vary depending on where you are, the relationship of the moon to the Earth, and also the relationship of the moon to the sun. There's also a sidereal month, and that is the orbit of the moon, again, seen from Earth geocentrically, like all traditional astronomy, against the fixed stars. This is what's used for the mansions of the moon. And this takes 27.3 days. So interestingly enough, as an attorney, early in my career, I was involved in a case that revolved around the definition of a month. The case is called Turner v. Bailey. It's very important because that definition of month determined whether you had a right to jury trial in particular cases. So it was actually became a very pressing issue in the case. The decision of the court was that a month was a calendar month, which was not really too shocking given the circumstances. The oldest lunar calendar appears to be about 30,000 BC. They have a carved bone that looks like it has moon phases on it. If you do a lunar year of 12 months, it's 355 days, and that gets out of sync with the seasons of the year. And that's our third fundamental unit, which is the year. Again, from our perspective, it's the orbit of the sun around the Earth. If you go out in space, a heliocentric perspective, it's the orbit of the Earth around the sun. Just as, again, from a heliocentric perspective, the Earth spins on its axis, that causes the day, but from our standpoint, geocentrically, the sun rises and sets for the day. We don't want to get too hung up about what the real one is. I mean, these are all accurate depending on where your perspective is. It's good to understand these different perspectives, but it certainly doesn't throw out the whole idea of a day by saying, oh, if you're in space, it's Earth spinning on its axis. But in any case, a year is about 365 days and 4 hours and change. And so if you use a 365-day calendar, then you have to keep adding days in to keep it in sync with the orbit of the sun. The earliest solar calendars look to be Egyptian, based on the heliacal rising of the fixed star Sirius, which heralded the annual Nile flood. That was the beginning of their year. The Julius Caesar, I think this is about 30-40 BC, replaced the Roman lunar calendar, which is way out of whack with the seasons with the solar calendar, the Julian calendar. And then Pope Gregory the 13th in 1582 did some changes to the Julian calendar and updated it to the Gregorian calendar in order to accurately, this is what leap years come from. In order to keep in sync with the orbit of the sun, you need to occasionally add in a leap year. You can look it up on Wikipedia or Google if you want to look at the exact what they do for it. The Gregorian calendar was adopted in like I said 1580 by the Catholics. Because it was the Pope, there was political problems, and the Gregorian calendar wasn't adopted by the British and the American colonies until 1752. This is the current calendar that we use, 365 days with the leap years added into it. And so you've got days, which 24 hours in a day, and then you have 7 days in a week, 12 months in the year, and then the Gregorian calendar. All these different fundamental measurements are adapted. Now they're abstracted a certain amount, right? I mean, as I said, they're not quite fitting with their natural cycle. In order to coordinate things, in order to have precision, you kind of have to step away a certain amount from having that natural cycle. But this, it's at the time, it seems like it's worth it because it's useful to have the coordination and precision, and it's not that much of a sacrifice. If we think about timekeeping, how you measure timekeeping, obviously the most fundamental would be the natural rising and setting of the sun for the day. I mean, even birds do that. It's amazing if you get up before dawn, it's quiet, the sun rises, then you hear all the birds waking up and making all sorts of noise and chatter and everything. And then when it gets dark, they go to sleep. And depending on what kind of animal, it's a nocturnal animal or a crepuscular animal that comes out at twilight, they'll come out. So they're very well adapted to the natural rising and setting of the sun. And it's true of us as animals as well. We have circadian rhythms, circadian clocks, which again are set and are based on the sunrise. That's the natural cycle for us. If you look back at Greek and Roman timekeeping, the Roman day was was called a natural day from sunrise to sunset, and then each hour would be a 12th of that. And then from sunset to sunrise of the next day is also the night, and you divide that in 12. So what that ends up with was, again, except at the equinoxes where the days and nights are equal in the northern and southern hemisphere, these are unequal hours. So like I said, it's called unequal or natural hours. These are what we use for planetary hours as well. A sundial typically would use the unequaled hours. You can make sundials that do the type of hours that we use now, and I'll talk about them a little later. Your typical timekeeping would be with sundials or water clocks. When we come to the Middle Ages, one of the most interesting inventions for timekeeping in the Middle Ages was the hourglass. So you've got the sand running through running down. That's very accurate as well. As we get further into the Middle Ages, they invent mechanical clocks. Again, we're familiar with clockwork and the dials and everything like that that can ring. The most accurate timekeeping you can do though is with an astrolabe. So again, you take out the astrolabe, you do an astronomical observation of the sun with the astrolabe, and you're able to get, that's the most accurate timing that's possible, was using an astrolabe. So again, you've got an astrological, astronomical function coming right in there. So the other thing that was, it wasn't necessarily invented in the Middle Ages, but came to be much more used then, were what's called the equinoctial hours. And that's the hours that the system that we use, which is rather than having unequal hours depending on sunrise and sunset, we have 24 equal hours, 60 minutes each, starting at midnight. And this was apparently used astronomically, but in order to get the equinoctial hours, you basically need astronomical calculations, but you can also use a water clock or mechanical clock. It also is technically possible to do it with a sundial. For the most part, the mechanical clock is the best way to do that. Now, you can make a mechanical clock that does unequal hours, but it's more complicated than just doing standard hours. So that was part of the reason for using the equinoctial hours. The other thing is that the unequal hours are going to vary depending on your location, whereas the equinoctial hours are always the same. So again, you're moving from this natural cycle to having a much more precise, accurate, and then widespread use of the timekeeping, which is more, you're able to coordinate people over a longer distance. One of the big uses of timekeeping in the Middle Ages was for the canonical hours, for doing the various services. If you're a priest or a monk, you do these hours during the day, lauds, sext. There's all sorts of different ones that they're done, and those are important for timekeeping, so they could do the prayers and hymns and everything. They're doing the services at those appropriate times. So as we can see, as we're developing along, we're starting out with these natural timekeeping cycles, and then in order to be more precise and more accurate and do more coordination, we're sort of stepping away from the actual cycle, and we start abstracting it. A similar example of that in measurement would be a yard. Okay, and originally yard was from the distance from the tip of your finger to your elbow. Well, obviously that's going to be different for every person, so you make up a yard of a set measurement, and then everybody can use that, which obviously makes sense. The problem with the cycles is that, again, you're stepping away from these natural cycles. Another example of that would be, in the timekeeping, would be that using the mean solar day. So you average it in the entire year for equinoctial hours, and to divide the 24 hours by and then also minutes, rather than a variable actual day. Nowadays, what we're getting to the point of is that we've got extremely small time units that are very precise. So rather than using these natural cycles, the definition of a minute or second or hour is in terms of the frequency oscillation of atoms. Often use cesium, but atomic clocks are what's used. So essentially, you have a fundamental unit that's based upon this oscillation of atoms, and has been completely abstracted from. Originally it was from these natural cycles. Now it has nothing more to do with them. Another implication of that is they want to stop doing leap seconds, because the Earth's rotation is variable, and they can see it precisely enough to see that, oh my gosh, our timekeeping is 1 second out of sync with the Earth's orbit, so we need to adjust that. And there's this agitation to say, let's not doing that anymore. It's messing things up. It's messing with the precision. So, as I said, the astrologically, obviously there's an implication of astrology and astronomy, because these are originally natural cycles. We've gone through this process of sort of stepping away from the natural cycles and getting more and more precise and more using them for coordination. Obviously, if you're going to have everyone come to work at the same time, you can't have different timekeeping. If you're going to coordinate with somebody, you want to have a meeting, you're going to be in another continent, again, you need to have your timekeeping precise so that you can coordinate. So as part of that process, the um, we can look at the creation of time zones. Um, so again, if you're talking about specific timing, the local mean time, what was used everywhere, even though you're using a watch, you set that to noon when the sun is directly overhead at your location. So that means every location, is as long as they're east-west, I think that's right, east-west is going to have a different time. So this became to be very complicated for railroads because they're going across the entire country in the United States. Every town had a different time. It's extremely hard for them to figure out where they coordinate things and get the trains on schedule. If you had trains that weren't on schedule, you could run into each other or have accidents, all sorts of problems. In addition to just the overall coordination of schedules and what time the train's gonna leave and things like that. So the railroads got together and invented time zones. So if you think about it, there's 24 hours in the day. So if you look at the entire world, the logical thing would be to have 24 time zones. It would cover basically an hour. So the sun is going to be at noon if your local time, basically if you're in the middle of the zone, would be the way that you do it. And then it'd be sort of 11:30 on one edge and 12:30 p.m. on the other edge. So what you're ending up with is a situation that everybody in that time zone, depending on where you are, is going to have more or less off in terms of having the sun directly overhead at noon. So again, they're out of sync with that natural cycle. Now, what complicates things is the time zones were never done geographically. And so they're always, in the United States, they're typically done by state. And so you've got a lot of weird stuff going on. There's always an approximation. Indiana was completely confusing because you had time zones county by county, and sometimes they would be observing like standard time, but then observing daylight time and writing down birth times and standard time. Complete, utter mess. Very confusing. And then you've got situations like, for example, Arizona is permanently on standard time, all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of political stuff that comes into that makes it much more confusing. And definitely getting you out of sync with the even more out of sync than with a geographic time zone with the local mean time and your local cycle of sunrise and sunset. But again, if you're going to have any kind of any way in tune with the sunrise and sunset, you're going to have time zones. Now, I get confused. I mean, I'm always switching, Eastern time and Central time, like it's an hour ahead or hour behind, or Pacific to Central time. I always get that confused. I don't even want to think about doing a general, GMT, Greenwich Mean Time to Central Time, or Australian AST, AEST to Central Time. I have to use a computer online. It's inherently confusing. And then it's almost like a mental jet lag. I mean, it's if you think of flying, you have that jet lag with changing circadian rhythms. Just trying to wrap your head around the time zone stuff is complicated. I remember one of the weirdest things was being in Japan and being a day ahead of the Midwest. That was really bizarre. Now, so you've got the time zone stuff, which is confusing enough. Then you add in daylight savings time. So what this was a bright idea to say, okay, let's monkey with the precision and coordination function of timekeeping, and let's somehow adjust the sunlight stuff. Now, I have actually had people that somehow think that daylight savings time changes the actual amount of daylight. All it does is change the time, the apparent time of it. And again, it doesn't change anything at all. I mean, the sunrise and sunset is going to be exactly the actual real time it is. What your timekeeping, though, changes. Now, this was one of those great ideas in World War I, along with Prohibition. That worked out really well. And so what I would say astrologically, again, the daylight savings time versus standard time has zero impact on prediction. What it does impact astrologically is precision. And because we need to have the exact time, date, and place. And if you don't know what the exact time is, it totally messes everything up in terms of the chart. So anything that adds confusion or lack of precision into astrological coordination or astrological calculation is going to be problematic. I mean, AM and PM is another one. AM and PM is I mess that up all the time. And I suppose it would probably be more logical to have 24-hour time. And some of my students actually use 24-hour time, and that's good. I just am so used to AM and PM that I haven't been able to make the switch. But it would actually be, from a precision standpoint, better to use 24-hour time, the military time. Um, Now, in terms of daylight savings time, I don't want to get into the daylight savings time versus standard debate, because what I think is the problem with that debate is that this is unnecessary linkage of, uh, people argue, well, I want more sunshine at night, so I want, in the nights I want daylight savings time, or I want it in the morning, so I want standard time. The problem here is that it doesn't solve the underlying problem of the mismatch between wanting to have the same opening and closing hours, or wanting to have this widespread coordination of things, and the fact that there's seasonal variation and individual location variation in terms of sunrise and sunset. No matter what you do with that daylight savings time or standard time, you cannot solve that problem. And part of it is this idea, just as a thought experiment, think about the idea that of having everybody on Greenwich Mean Time all the time. Now, what that would mean is that, oh, I'm getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, or whatever, and the time change, the day change would be weird too. But think about divorcing entirely the timing of things from this idea that, oh, I have 9 to 5. I mean, why do you have to go to work at 9? I have to go to work at 9 o'clock. So we have to change around the entire system to conform to the fact that I want to go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning. It seems to me the logical thing to do is to just have summer hours. I mean, you just put it on whatever, daylight savings time or standard time or whatever, and then use that to do the timekeeping. You keep the precision, you keep the coordination, and then people can choose how they want to conform to that, as opposed to like, okay, we have to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning. I mean, this is arbitrary. When you got to this point, it's completely arbitrary in terms of what 7 o'clock is, because you're in a time zone, you're daylight savings time, that is very far abstracted from the local mean time and that natural cycle. So, again, that's what I would say, is that really, from an astrological standpoint, anything that leads to more precision and less confusion is useful. And what I would say is that we've kind of made this automatic assumption, that I have to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I have to do that through the entire year. Well, you could get up at the same relative time to sunset, the same amount of light, and adjust that throughout the year. Like I said, you could have summer or winter hours. You could have people have a little more autonomy, like with the work at home stuff, a more autonomy in terms of when they do things, and then it'd be less of a problem. So like I said, I think that this daylight savings time versus standard time debate is problematic, because ultimately the purpose of timekeeping is, and the modern timekeeping, is precision and coordination, so that we're all on the same page, so that we're coming to meeting at the same time and there's not confusion. And I think that certainly the switch between daylight savings time and standard time is very confusing. But in general, this idea that we have to be at a specific time that's basically arbitrary doesn't make a lot of sense. So again, I don't expect to convince anybody about this. I'll probably get people saying I'm wrong. I don't know what I'm talking about. But that's what I would say, is that think about the idea, like I said, of having everybody on Greenwich Mean Time, and then you determine your own schedule, And they say, yeah, I'll see you at 3 o'clock, and I'll see you at 3 a.m. And, that's, when you have lunch, for example. There doesn't have to be this lockstep between like I said, 12 o'clock is lunchtime. Not necessarily so. Something to think about, but I think it's also useful just to get an idea of these considerations with astrology. I want to talk about a couple other things, in terms of timekeeping, that come into play with astrology. Again, not from a predictive standpoint, but something to think about in terms of the accuracy of your timekeeping. One thing that I think it's kind of interesting is that for an accurate chart, the timing, like for a birth chart, getting that time of birth right is much more important than the location. I mean, people will give me their hospital. It's like, it's not necessary to do that, because the city is sufficient. At my latitude, in the northern hemisphere, a degree on the ascendant is going to be the same for everybody within about a 50 to 60 mile radius. Okay, that's a long way away. And so the hospital versus just New York, this Manhattan hospital versus Manhattan, isn't going to make any difference at all. Whereas the degree rising on the ascendant varies much more based on time. So again, I just checked at my location. There's something called signs of long ascension and signs of short ascension. So some of the signs of the zodiac, I mean, approximately you got 24 hours. So the average time is going to be 12 hours. But because of the way the ecliptic is tilted and where you are, your location, some signs are going to rise faster and are going to get through in less than 2 hours, and some are going to take more than 2 hours. So the signs of long ascension are Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, and Sagittarius. And the ones of short ascension are Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, Taurus, and Gemini. Okay, so I just kind of did an experiment looking at charts, and it was 5 minutes per degree in Virgo and 3 minutes per degree in Aries. So Virgo's a long ascension and Aries is short ascension. So think about that. If you get your time off by 7 minutes, right? That's equivalent to being 100 miles away. So when you're thinking about charts, the timing is really key, whereas the location is less important. So again, I think that's interesting and useful. But ultimately, what you want to do is focus on making sure that you get accurate timekeeping to give yourself an accurate chart. And it's interesting to understand these sort of background issues. But as an astrologer, we don't need to worry about daylight savings or standard time as long as we know which is which. And that's and a lot of my students, I'm like, they'll do the timing and they're not saying daylight savings time or standard time. You need to do that. They're not saying what time zone they're in. You need to do that. Absolutely key, absolutely important and precise. But again, it's something that's confusing. I mean, like I said, I personally find time zone stuff confusing. So important to focus on, and it's interesting to get these other issues as far as, like I said, from an astrological standpoint, I don't care what they do as far as standard time or daylight savings time. Let's just quit switching around, get one time that we're on, and then that would certainly make it easier for astrologers. Now, getting up in the morning and all that, totally different issue. It's something that astrologically, I mean, maybe I have an attitude about it or an opinion about it personally, but as an astrologer, it's not something that comes into prediction or into precision. So I think that's useful and interesting, and I hope there's, you can search all this stuff on Google or Wikipedia if you want more information about the history of the year or timekeeping or all that sort of stuff. Very useful. But I think this is a useful jumping off point and useful background for astrologers and students of astrology.